Charles, shouldn't you be serving the table with those grease-stained hands? Patricia's sharp voice echoed through the elegant dining room, causing all the guests to stop talking and look directly at me. I was standing, holding an expensive porcelain plate, wearing a worn shirt and faded pants that I had carefully chosen for the occasion. My daughter-in-law's family reunion was taking place at her parents' mansion in Beverly Hills, where every object seemed to scream wealth and status. "I'm sorry," I muttered softly, lowering my head as if I were genuinely ashamed. I tried to wash it thoroughly, but the work at the workshop. Robert, my daughter-in-law's father, sighed loudly and shook his head. "Jessica, please tell your father-in-law he can sit down. We have employees for these tasks." His tone was that of someone talking about a poorly trained pet. "My name is Charles, I am 62 years old, and I have just been treated like an incompetent servant in my daughter-in-law's family home. For the past 15 years, since my wife died, I have raised my son David alone while working as a mechanic. At least, that's the version everyone knows. The truth is slightly different. In reality, I own a chain of specialty repair shops that services corporate fleets for 300 companies in 8 states. My net worth exceeds $8 million. And those grease-stained hands Patricia mentioned? This morning, they signed a $2.3 million expansion contract for Texas. But no one in this room knows that. Jessica, my daughter-in-law, tried to smooth things over. "Dad, Charles was just trying to help." "Honey," Patricia interrupted, "you need to teach your father-in-law about proper protocols. This is not the kind of environment where you act like you're in a neighborhood repair shop." I humbly agreed, as if I were really a simple man trying to fit into a world he doesn't understand. In fact, I was mentally cataloging every comment, every disdainful look, every gesture of superiority. Robert turned to David, my son. "David, we need to talk about the family's financial situation. With the baby coming, you're going to need a bigger apartment, private school, premium health insurance. Things that, frankly, are beyond your father's means." David tensed up. I could see he was uncomfortable, but there was also something in his eyes that made me worried. Something that looked like agreement. "I know, Robert," David replied. "I've been thinking about it." Patricia smiled triumphantly. "I'm glad you're being realistic. We can help financially, of course. After all, our grandson deserves the best that money can buy." She looked at me with that expression I recognized immediately. It was the same look rich people give poor people when they want to show condescending charity. "Charles, we don't want you to feel bad about this. We know you did the best you could raising David on your own. But now he's part of a family that can offer him real opportunities." I nodded silently, maintaining the expression of a humble man who accepts his lower position in the social hierarchy. Inside, however, I was mentally finalizing the details of a plan I had begun to devise weeks ago. What they didn't know was that for the past 2 months, I had been preparing for this moment. It was no coincidence that I was dressed like an ordinary mechanic. It was no accident that I had arrived by bus instead of using my Mercedes. Every detail had been calculated to provoke exactly this kind of reaction. As Patricia continued to explain how my presence could be awkward at future social events, I just smiled inwardly. Because the following weekend, at my grandson's christening, when all of Beverly Hills high society was in attendance, they would find out who Charles really is. And the discovery would be absolutely devastating to their inflated egos. If you're enjoying this revenge story and want to find out how an underestimated grandfather can completely turn the tables, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow every twist and turn. But first, let me tell you how I got to this point, because the humiliation I was about to unleash had deep roots. And David, my own son, was about to learn a lesson that would forever change the way he saw both me and the family he had just married into. The conversation about financial assistance stretched on throughout the afternoon, each word carefully chosen to remind me of my supposed inferiority. Robert had positioned himself at the head of the mahogany table like a CEO conducting a board meeting, gesturing with his $50,000 Rolex watch as if it were a presentation pointer. "Look, Charles," he said, leaning forward with that condescending expression rich people use when explaining the obvious to poor people. "It's not that we don't value your work. Mechanics are essential to society. But let's be realistic about the financial limitations of your profession." Patricia nodded vigorously, her diamond earrings tinkling like warning bells. "Exactly. And with a baby on the way, David and Jessica will need at least $10,000 a month just to cover the basics. Private school, premium health insurance, a qualified nanny, appropriate clothing. I kept up my expression of a humble man trying to follow calculations beyond my comprehension. In reality, I was mentally checking the numbers on my latest acquisition, a Phoenix-based corporate fleet repair shop I had purchased for $0.2 million cash the week before. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first 15 minutes, he had tried to defend his father. Now, however, I could see something changing in his eyes. Something that made me genuinely concerned. David, dear, Patricia continued, you need to understand that there is no shame in accepting our help. We have resources. Your father, she gestured vaguely in my direction, has limitations. Robert pulled an Italian leather briefcase from the chair beside him. We've already spoken to our financial advisor. We can set up a trust fund for the baby, cover all educational expenses through college, and even provide a monthly allowance for the two of you. That's very generous, David murmured. And completely necessary, Patricia added. After all, you can't rely on your father's inheritance. Mechanics don't leave an estate, do they? The question hung in the air like an insult disguised as a factual observation. I nodded timidly, as if I really were a man who worked with his hands and lived from paycheck to paycheck. In fact, my current will left David more than $8 million, divided between diversified investments, commercial properties, and stakes in 3 companies. But he would only find that out when I decided to reveal it. Jessica finally spoke, her voice hesitant. Maybe we could talk about this in private. Nonsense, Robert interrupted. Charles is part of the family. He needs to understand the real financial situation so he doesn't create unrealistic expectations about his ability to contribute. Patricia smiled with false tenderness. Charles, dear, we don't want you to feel pressured to spend money you don't have. We know mechanics earn, what, $3,000 a month? $4,000 in good months. I tried not to smile as I remembered that my monthly passive income from commercial rents was $120,000. That's not counting the operating profits from the workshops. More or less, I replied in the voice of a man accustomed to calculating pennies. Robert opened the folder and spread documents on the table. Look here. These are the actual costs of raising a child properly in Beverly Hills. Designer nursery, $2,000 a month. Certified nanny, $4,000. Private pediatrician, $500 per visit. Appropriate clothing for social events. The list went on for 20 minutes. Each item was presented as irrefutable evidence that I was financially unfit to participate in my grandson's life. During this presentation, I watched David carefully. I recognized that look. It was the same look I had at 25, when I still believed that personal worth was directly related to bank balance. Before I learned that money was just a tool, not a measure of character. Patricia noticed my observation and intensified her attack. Charles, you must be wondering how you can contribute to your son's new life. And we have some constructive suggestions. She produced a second, smaller folder, as if it were a backup plan for desperate cases. First, maybe you could help with manual labor. Fix things around the house, basic maintenance. Second, you could take care of the baby occasionally so we can save on the nanny. Third. She paused dramatically, looking at Robert as if they were sharing a difficult decision. Third. I asked meekly. Well, Robert took over, we could help you find a better job. Maybe as a janitor in one of our commercial buildings. The salary would be more stable, there would be basic benefits, and you would be contributing to the family in a more structured way. The offer was so condescending that I felt a genuine pang of anger. Not at the job suggestion. Honest work has never been demeaning, but at the premise that I needed to be rescued from my current life. David finally reacted. Guys, maybe we're going too far. David, Patricia said firmly, you're about to be a father. You need to think responsibly, not emotionally. Your father is a good man, certainly, but he can't offer our grandson the opportunities we can. Robert agreed. Exactly. And Charles, we're not trying to replace you. Just a supplement where there are natural gaps. Natural gaps. As if poverty were a birth defect. I understand perfectly, I replied, keeping my tone humble. You want the best for the baby. I'm glad you understand, Patricia sighed with relief. Some people would take it personally. I nodded like a man accustomed to accepting his place in the social hierarchy. Inside, however, I was mentally finalizing the details of what would happen at the christening. Because Patricia and Robert were about to discover that natural gaps are sometimes just optical illusions. And when all of Beverly Hills high society was watching, when social photographers were documenting the event, when there was no way to hide or reinterpret what they saw, this family would learn a lesson about hasty judgments they would never forget. But first, they still had a whole week to continue underestimating me. A week to dig an even deeper hole of arrogance and prejudice. And I intended to let them dig until they could no longer see the surface. The conversation about my financial inadequacy continued into dinner, each word carefully crafted to establish my position as the poor relation of the family. Robert had turned the living room into a kind of informal courtroom, where my future as a grandfather was being judged and found wanting. "Charles, you need to understand reality," Patricia said, adjusting her pearls as if they were a medallion of authority. "Our grandson cannot grow up confused about standards of living. If you show up driving that rusty truck to his school events, it will create unnecessary embarrassment." I nodded humbly, as if I really were a man who didn't understand the social complexities of high society. In fact, I was mentally calculating how much it would cost to buy the building where Robert kept his offices. Somewhere around $12 million, an amount I could pay in cash without significantly compromising my portfolio. David shifted uncomfortably in his Italian leather armchair. "Guys, maybe we're being a little too harsh." "David dear," Robert interrupted him with the exaggerated patience of someone explaining simple concepts to children, "you're about to be a father. You need to think strategically, not emotionally. Your father is a good man, I'm sure, but kindness doesn't pay for private schools." Jessica tried once again to mediate the situation. "Maybe we could establish some guidelines that work for everyone." "Guidelines, excellent idea." Patricia clapped her hands as if Jessica had suggested something brilliant. "Charles, how about we talk about realistic expectations for your role as a grandfather?" She produced a gold notepad, apparently prepared for this conversation. The level of premeditation impressed me. They weren't improvising, they had planned this systematic humiliation. First, Patricia began reading important social events. Graduations, weddings, significant birthday parties. It would be best if you participated discreetly. Perhaps arriving later, leaving earlier, avoiding official photos where you appear out of place. I continued to nod meekly as I mentally reviewed my schedule for the coming week. Monday, meeting with Japanese investors interested in expanding our chain to the Pacific. Tuesday, signing a contract to acquire a logistics company in Denver. Wednesday, interview with Forbes magazine about innovation in corporate automotive services. Second, Patricia continued, gifts. We know you want to express love through gifts, but it would be best to coordinate with us first. We don't want our grandson to receive inappropriate items that don't match his standard of living. Robert agreed emphatically. Exactly. Imagine if you bought a $50 toy for a child accustomed to $500 electronics. It would create confusion about values. The irony was almost funny. My gift budget last Christmas for employees had been $300,000. I distributed individual bonuses larger than Robert's annual salary. Third, Patricia continued relentlessly, clothing. For family events, we would need you to present yourself in a more appropriate manner. Perhaps we could help financially with some basic items. Nothing extravagant, just what is necessary to avoid embarrassment. David finally exploded. Enough. You're being ridiculous. He's my father, not an employee who has to follow a dress code. Patricia sighed dramatically. David, your loyalty to your father is admirable, but you need to consider your son's well-being. Children notice these social differences. They ask questions. Imagine explaining to our grandson why his paternal grandfather looks like a manual laborer, while his maternal grandparents represent success and stability. Something changed in David's face. I recognized that expression. It was the same one I had decades ago, when I still believed that outward appearance defined personal worth. When I thought financial success was synonymous with human success. Maybe, David said slowly, we could find a middle ground. Dad, you wouldn't mind dressing up a little more for special occasions, would you? The question hurt more than all of Patricia and Robert's direct insults. Because it came from my own son. The man I had raised to value character over bank accounts was beginning to question whether I was suitable to be the grandfather of his own grandson. Of course, son, I replied meekly. Anything for the baby. Patricia smiled triumphantly. I'm glad we've come to an understanding. Now, about the financial issue. Robert opened a new folder, thicker than the previous ones. Charles, we don't want you to feel pressured to contribute financially beyond your means. But there are certain, symbolic contributions that could demonstrate your commitment to your grandson's well-being. Symbolic contributions? I asked. Well, Patricia took control, for example. You could help with small expenses. Diapers, basic medications, perhaps a monthly contribution of $200 to an educational fund. Nothing that would break your budget, but something that would demonstrate participation. $200. They were offering me the chance to contribute $200 a month toward my own grandson's education. The amount I spent weekly on gas for the company helicopter alone. That seems fair, I agreed humbly. Robert visibly relaxed. Excellent. And of course, we'll cover all the really significant expenses. Education, healthcare, extracurricular activities, family trips. Family trips? I asked. Patricia waved her hand. Oh, you don't need to worry about that. We're planning to take our grandson to see the world. Europe in the summer, skiing in Aspen in the winter, maybe a safari in Africa when he's older. Experiences that will broaden his horizons. Once again, the irony hit me. I had vacation homes on 3 continents and a private jet permanently parked at Van Nuys Airport. But I was being excluded from my grandson's horizon-broadening experiences. Jessica finally spoke, her voice hesitant. Maybe Charles could join us on some of these trips. Robert and Patricia exchanged a glance. Honey, Robert said carefully, these are very specific environments. 5-star resorts, private clubs, sophisticated social events. We don't want Charles to feel uncomfortable in situations where he clearly wouldn't fit in. Besides, Patricia added, the costs would be prohibitive for him. International airfare, luxury accommodations, meals at award-winning restaurants. It would be cruel to suggest that he spend his entire life savings on a single trip. David was quiet now, processing. I could see the calculations going on in his mind. He was weighing his love for me against the opportunities Patricia and Robert could offer his son. I understand, he finally said. Perhaps it would be best if Charles participated in the parts, more suited to his budget. It was at that moment that I made my final decision. There were no more doubts, no more hope that this was just a misunderstanding or prenatal nerves. My own son was judging me unfit to be the grandfather of his own grandchild. You're right, I replied, keeping my voice humble. I don't want to be a burden. I want what's best for the baby, even if that means accepting my limitations. Patricia practically beamed with satisfaction. Charles, you're so understanding. That shows true grandfatherly love, putting the child's well-being above your own ego. Robert nodded in agreement. Exactly. And who knows? Maybe in the future, when you're more financially established, we can re-evaluate some of these guidelines. More financially established. As if a 62-year-old man could magically transform a career as a mechanic into enough wealth to impress the Beverly Hills elite. As they continued to plan how to minimize my presence in my grandson's life, I began to mentally finalize the details of what would happen at the christening. Because next Saturday, when 500 high society guests were gathered at the Cathedral of St. Vibiana, when social photographers were documenting every moment, when there was no way to deny or reinterpret what they saw, Patricia, Robert, and even David would learn a lesson about hasty judgments that would echo for the next 50 years of their lives. But first, they still had 5 days to keep digging. 5 days to make the humiliation that was about to rain down on them even more devastating and publicly irreversible. And I intended to let them dig until they could no longer see the light of day. Over the next 5 days, Patricia and Robert became even bolder in their attempts to reform me for the christening. On Monday morning, I received a call that almost made me laugh out loud. Charles, dear, Patricia's sugary voice sounded over the phone. Robert and I have been thinking about your appearance at the christening. It would be best if you arrived, discreetly, perhaps through the back of the cathedral, to avoid unnecessary embarrassment. I kept my voice humble and grateful. Of course, Patricia. Anything for the baby. How understanding of you. And about the clothes, we've already arranged something appropriate. Nothing extravagant, just a basic suit that won't attract negative attention. Robert has a tailor who makes adjustments for people in simpler situations. People in simpler circumstances. As if poverty were a medical condition requiring specialized treatment. That's very generous, I replied meekly. And Charles, Patricia continued, during the ceremony, it would be best if you stayed in the back rows. Near the cathedral staff. That way you can participate without standing out from the rest of the family. As she spoke, I was mentally reviewing the final preparations for Saturday. The Augusta Westland AW-139 helicopter was already booked, with a flight plan approved to land on the cathedral lawn at 11:30 a.m. The pilot had specific instructions about the dramatic entrance, low, slow, impossible to ignore. I understand perfectly, I agreed. You've thought of everything. On Tuesday, David called. His voice sounded different, distant. As if he were doing his father a favor rather than talking to him. Dad, Patricia and Robert want to know if you need help with transportation to the christening. They can send an Uber to pick you up. An Uber. As if I were someone who couldn't arrange my own transportation. That would be helpful, I replied humbly. I don't want to be late. And Dad, David hesitated. Maybe it's better if you don't try to mingle too much with the other guests. They're important people, business people, politicians. You might feel out of place. Every word was like a stab in the heart. My own son was asking me to be invisible at my grandson's ceremony. Of course, son. I understand. Meanwhile, I was finalizing details that David could never have imagined. On Wednesday, I confirmed the final arrangements with my executive assistant. The guest list I had sent included 12 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, the governor of California, 2 senators, and the archbishop who would conduct the ceremony, all people who knew Charles Sterling, the businessman, not Charles, the humble mechanic. On Thursday, Patricia escalated her attempts at control even further. She showed up at the workshop where I actually worked a few hours a week to maintain the facade. Charles, I need to talk to you about realistic expectations for the future. She surveyed the environment with barely concealed disgust, as if visiting a particularly unpleasant zoo. Robert and I have decided it would be best to establish some permanent guidelines for your relationship with our grandson. She pulled a folder out of her purse that looked like it had been prepared by lawyers. First, supervised visits. We don't want you spending time alone with the child until he's old enough to understand social differences. I continued wiping my hands with the cloth, keeping my expression neutral as she systematically destroyed my role as a grandfather. Second, pre-approved gifts. Anything you want to give our grandson must go through us for approval first. We can't have inappropriate toys or gifts that send conflicting messages about standards of living. Third, she paused dramatically, special events. Graduations, important birthdays, proms. It would be best if you didn't actively participate. Perhaps watching from afar, so as not to create awkwardness. Each word was calculated to reduce me to a ghost in my own grandson's life. A grandfather who existed only on the margins, always reminding everyone of the family's shame. I agree with everything, I replied meekly. You know what's best. Patricia smiled triumphantly. What a relief to see that you're a rational person. Some people would take this personally. Later that afternoon, I called my personal attorney, Jonathan Blackwood, a senior partner at one of Los Angeles's leading law firms. Jonathan, I need you to be present at Saturday's christening. Bring all the documentation of my assets. Bank statements, investment portfolio, property deeds, everything. Of course, Charles. May I ask why? I'm going to need to prove who I am to some people who have seriously underestimated me. On Friday, I received the final call from Patricia. Her voice was brimming with satisfaction. Charles, dear, just confirming the details for tomorrow. The Uber will arrive at 9 in the morning. You will enter through the back of the cathedral at 9:45. The suit we sent should fit properly. And remember, discreet and respectful. Understood, I replied. I'll be there exactly as planned. And I would be. Just not in the way she imagined. While Patricia talked about how awkward it would be if I tried to sit in the front rows, I was looking out the window of my executive office on the 23rd floor, mentally reviewing every detail of what would happen in less than 18 hours. The helicopter would land just as the ceremony was reaching its climax, with 500 guests from Beverly Hills elite in attendance. The cathedral's security cameras would capture everything. The society photographers would document every second. And when I stepped off that aircraft, wearing my $6,000 Armani suit, with Jonathan carrying the briefcase of documents proving my $8 million net worth, when the guests who knew me as Charles Sterling began greeting the humble mechanic, Patricia, Robert, and David would learn a lesson about hasty judgments that would echo for the rest of their lives. If you're following this elaborate revenge story and want to find out how an underestimated grandfather can completely turn the tables in the most public moment possible, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the epic conclusion. But first, let me tell you about the final preparations on Friday night. Because while they slept peacefully, confident in their social superiority, I was making the final calls that would turn my grandson's christening into the most embarrassing event in Beverly Hills social history. And unlike all the humiliations I had received during the week, this one would be irreversible, documented, and completely public. At 11:29 a.m. on Saturday morning, I was checking the final details at the private heliport in Van Nuys. The gleaming Augusta Westland AW-139 waited, its rotors still static, while the pilot finished his pre-flight checks. "Mr. Sterling," said Jonathan Blackwood, my lawyer, adjusting his tie as he held the leather briefcase containing all the documentation of my estate. "Are you sure you want to do this way? It's quite dramatic." I smiled as I adjusted my $6,000 Armani suit. "Jonathan, after a week of being treated like an incompetent employee, believe me, dramatic is exactly what the situation calls for." At 11:30, we were flying over Beverly Hills. Below, I could see the meticulously manicured grounds of St. Vibiana's Cathedral, where 500 guests from the social elite had already gathered for my grandson's christening. Luxury cars filled the parking lot like an exhibition of wealth and status. "Approach in 1 minute, Mr. Sterling," the pilot announced over the intercom. "All security protocols have been approved. The South Lawn has been cordoned off as requested." Through the window, I could see exactly what I had planned. The ceremony was in full swing, with the Archbishop at the altar and all the guests facing forward. Patricia and Robert occupied the front row, dressed like royalty, radiating satisfaction at being the center of Beverly Hills social attention. David held my grandson, still unaware that his father was about to completely rewrite the family narrative they had built over the week. The helicopter began its descent. The sound of the rotors cut through the air like a symphony of vengeance. At first, it was just a distant hum. Then, a growing roar that made everyone turn their heads toward the sky. Confused murmurs echoed through the crowd as our aircraft appeared on the horizon, gleaming in the California sun. "What the hell?" I heard someone shout as we began to land on the perfectly manicured lawn. Patricia was standing now, her face contorted in an expression of utter horror. Not because a helicopter was landing at her grandson's ceremony, but because she immediately recognized that it meant money. Lots of money. The kind of money she and Robert spent months planning to flaunt at social events. Robert had his mouth open, staring at our aircraft as if it were a UFO landing in his backyard. The crowd of guests, CEOs, politicians, socialites, was in an uproar, some filming with their phones, others trying to identify who could be arriving in such spectacular fashion. "That's Charles Sterling's Augusta Westland AW-139, I heard someone shout. "What's he doing here?" Patricia froze. She literally froze in place when she heard the name Charles Sterling. Her eyes widened as if she had seen a ghost, and she began to look around desperately, searching for some explanation that made sense. Because Patricia knew Charles Sterling, the businessman, very well. She had tried to approach me at social events for years, always being politely rejected. The name Charles Sterling was on charity donor lists, in business magazines, in circles she aspired to frequent but never gained real access to. The helicopter touched down with professional smoothness. Through the windows, I could see the crowd approaching cautiously, curiosity overcoming confusion. Camera flashes began to fire as the doors opened. Jonathan stepped out first, immaculate in his $3,000 suit, carrying the briefcase that documented every penny of my $8 million net worth. Then I appeared. Charles Sterling. Not the humble mechanic who had been humiliated for an entire week. Charles Sterling, owner of a chain of corporate repair shops in 8 states, investor in commercial real estate, a man whose monthly passive income exceeded the annual salary of most people present. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles. The governor of California was the first to recognize me, walking straight toward me with a genuine smile. What a fantastic surprise to see you here. I didn't know you had a connection to this family. I do, I replied calmly, my voice carrying the natural authority I had hidden for days. This is my grandson's christening. The words echoed like a bomb detonating in slow motion. Patricia was white as a sheet. She looked from me to David, from David to Robert, desperately trying to process what was happening. Her eyes fixed on my suit, my discreet but expensive jewelry, the way other important businessmen approached me to greet me. Mr. Sterling, said Marcus Rothschild, CEO of one of the largest investment firms on the West Coast, congratulations on your grandson. And I must say, your latest acquisition in Phoenix was brilliant. Doubling the corporate portfolio in a single quarter. Robert was reeling. Literally reeling, as if he had been punched in the stomach. He had spent the entire week explaining to Charles, the mechanic, how money worked. Now he discovered he was giving finance lessons to a man whose personal wealth exceeded his own by at least 400%. David appeared at my side, holding my grandson, his eyes wide with utter shock. Dad. How you? Hello, son, I said calmly, extending my arms toward my grandson. Can I hold my grandson now? Or do you think my grease-stained hands will soil him? The crowd was now gathering, cameras flashing incessantly. Social reporters covering the event began taking frantic notes. This was no longer just a christening ceremony, it was the social event of the year. Charles Sterling, Patricia murmured, her voice almost inaudible. You're Charles Sterling. Yes, Patricia, I replied, my voice sharp as steel. I am Charles Sterling. The same Charles Sterling you tried to hire as a janitor. The same Charles Sterling to whom you offered $200 a month as a symbolic contribution to my own grandson. The circle of guests around us was growing. Everyone wanted to hear, everyone wanted to understand what was happening. The Beverly Hills elite loves a scandal, especially when it involves money and public humiliation. Jonathan approached with the open briefcase. Mr. Sterling, as requested, I brought all the documentation. Bank statements, investment portfolio, commercial property deeds. I took some documents from the briefcase. Patricia, Robert, you spent the whole week worrying about my financial ability to contribute to my grandson's life. Let me clear up your doubts. I showed them the first page. This is my bank statement from last month. As you can see, my passive income from commercial rentals alone was $120,000. That's not counting operating profits from the workshops or investment dividends. Patricia was shaking now. Physically shaking. This second page, I continued relentlessly, shows my current investment portfolio. $8.2 million in liquid assets, diversified among stocks, bonds, and real estate. Robert tried to speak, but could only manage incoherent sounds. And this third page, I finished, is the will my lawyer updated yesterday. It leaves everything to David and his son. All that money you thought I didn't have. The silence was absolute. 500 people from Beverly Hills high society witnessing the most complete public humiliation in recent social history. David finally found his voice. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me? Why did you let them treat you that way? I looked directly at my son. Because I needed to know, David. I needed to know if my family would love me for who I am, not for what I have. And I found out. Patricia fell to her knees on the lawn, her pearls scattering across the grass. The humiliation was so complete, so public, so irrevocable, that she had literally collapsed under the weight of her own hypocrisy. But the real twist was yet to come. Because while everyone was processing what had just happened, Jonathan took one last document out of his briefcase. And that document would change not only this ceremony, but the entire future of this family. Jonathan held up the last document, his voice cutting through the absolute silence that had settled over the cathedral lawn. This is the donation agreement that Mr. Sterling signed yesterday. $10 million to establish the Charles Sterling Educational Fund in his grandson's name. $10 million. The words echoed like thunder among the 500 guests. Patricia was literally on her knees on the grass, her pearls scattered around her like crystallized tears of her shattered arrogance. Robert had leaned against a nearby tree, his face pale as if he had seen a ghost. $10 million, I repeated calmly, looking directly at Patricia, to ensure that my grandson has access to the best schools in the world. Harvard, Oxford, MIT. Any institution he chooses. Without having to depend on your generosity. David was trembling, still holding my grandson, his eyes filled with tears of shame and regret. Dad. How could I? How could you what, David? I asked softly. Believe that money defines character? Assume that outward appearance reveals inner worth? Allow strangers to decide whether I was fit to be my own grandson's grandfather. The crowd around us was completely silent, absorbing every word. Cameras continued to flash, documenting what would be remembered as the biggest social scandal in Beverly Hills. You spent an entire week teaching me about standards of living, I continued, my voice carrying decades of dignity I had kept hidden. Let me teach you something about real values. I pointed to the helicopter, its rotors still spinning gently. That aircraft costs $2.5 million. I bought it outright 3 years ago. Not to impress anyone, not to compensate for insecurities, but because my time is worth more than any traffic inconvenience. Patricia tried to stand up, but her legs seemed to have lost all strength. My wealth, I continued relentlessly, was built over 40 years of honest work. I started out fixing cars in a rented garage. Today, I manage corporate contracts in 8 states. The difference between you and me is simple: I built wealth. You just inherited it and spend it. Robert finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. Charles, we didn't know, if we had known. If you had known, would you have treated me differently? I interrupted. Exactly. And that's the problem. You measure people's worth by their bank balance, not their character. You treat those you think are poor like trash and those you think are rich like royalty. Jessica approached hesitantly, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Sterling. My parents, they're not bad people. They're not bad people, Jessica, I agreed calmly. But they're not good people either. There's a huge difference between the two. Bad people cause harm intentionally. People like your parents cause harm through arrogance, prejudice, and lack of empathy. The governor of California approached again, his expression serious. Charles, that's an impressive demonstration. But perhaps we can resolve this more privately. I smiled at him. Governor, for an entire week I was publicly humiliated. I was treated like an incompetent employee, offered work as a janitor, suggested that I was a burden on my family. The humiliation was public. The revelation will be too. David finally approached, extending my grandson into my arms. Father, forgive me. Please forgive me for everything. I was blind, foolish, ungrateful. I accepted my grandson, feeling his small, confident weight in my arms. I looked at that innocent little face, then at David. Son, there is nothing to forgive. You were tested and you learned. That is growth. The question is, what exactly did you learn? David wiped away his tears. I learned that I spent my whole life underestimating the most extraordinary man I know. I learned that I let people without character influence my judgment of my own father. I learned that I almost lost the right to call you father because of my weakness. What about Patricia and Robert? I asked, my voice still firm. What did you learn about them? David looked at his in-laws, who remained in a state of absolute shock. I learned that they never loved me for who I am, but for what I represented to their social status. I learned that they tried to buy influence over my family with money. I learned that they are small people who only feel big by diminishing others. Patricia finally managed to stand up, leaning on Robert. Her voice came out broken, desperate. Charles. Mr. Sterling, we can start over. We can forget this week. We can be a family. I looked at her with something that wasn't anger, but it wasn't forgiveness either. It was simply clarity. Patricia, you have revealed who you really are. There's no way to forget that. There's no way to pretend it didn't happen. You had the opportunity to show kindness, empathy, respect for a stranger you judged to be poor. And you chose humiliation, cruelty, and prejudice. The Archbishop, who had been watching everything in silence, approached. Perhaps we can continue with the ceremony? The child still needs to be baptized. I nodded respectfully. Of course, Father. That is the only reason we are all here. As we headed back to the cathedral, Jonathan walked beside me. Mr. Sterling, the press will want statements. How do you want to proceed? No statements, I replied calmly. The story speaks for itself. 500 people witnessed everything. That's enough. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The guests whispered among themselves, many already posting discreetly on social media. Patricia and Robert sat in the back rows, completely isolated, while I took my rightful place in the front row, holding my grandson throughout the ritual. After the ceremony, as the guests dispersed in small groups, many approached me to congratulate me. Not out of financial interest, but out of genuine respect for what they had witnessed. David came to me one last time before we left. Dad, how did you do it? How did you maintain your dignity all this time? I smiled, looking at the helicopter waiting for us. Son, I learned long ago that true power doesn't need to be displayed to exist. Humility is not weakness when you choose to be humble. And the most effective revenge is not to cause pain, but to reveal the truth. 6 months later, Patricia and Robert divorced. The social scandal destroyed the reputation they had built over decades in Beverly Hills. Robert lost several important contracts when clients discovered how he treated people he considered inferior. Patricia was quietly excluded from all elite charity committees. David and Jessica moved into a modest home, refusing any financial help from her parents. David returned to visit me every week, bringing my grandson, not out of obligation, but out of genuine joy. On my grandson's first birthday, we organized a small intimate party in my backyard. Nothing extravagant, just real family and true friends. As I watched my grandson take his first steps on the grass, David approached me. Dad, thank you for teaching me that true wealth isn't in the bank account. Where is it, then? I asked, curious about his answer. David pointed to his grandson playing, to Jessica laughing with my sister, to the group of friends sharing honest stories. It's here. In this moment. In these people who love us for who we are, not for what we have. The biggest lesson I learned was not about revenge or justice, but about patience and truth. Sometimes the best response to prejudice is not immediate retaliation, but allowing people to reveal who they truly are before showing them who you truly are. If this story of transformation and dignity touched your heart, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how true humility can be the most powerful weapon against arrogance. Because in the end, the truth always finds a way to surface. And 5 years later, when I hear about Patricia and Robert, they still live in isolation, victims of their own smallness. Meanwhile, my grandson calls my helicopter grandpa's flying horse, and believes that every person deserves respect, regardless of the clothes they wear or the car they drive. That's the legacy that really matters.